I first teach myself English, that was many, many years ago, when I was still a rocket factory girl. Some of my colleagues laughed at my effort, calling me a toad who dreams to eat swan's meat. They said, "You're a little factory worker. What would you want to learn English for?" They had a fixed idea a factory worker could or could not do. Luckily, I did not listen to them. I wanted to learn English because I saw it as a possible tool to get myself out of the factory. When I was 16, my mother just dragged me out of school and put me to work. That was 1980. Now you clever people can quickly work out how old I am precisely. So, my mother just, this was not my choice. My mother just dragging me out of school. Becoming a factory worker was the likely fate to myself. I grew up with workers and their children in the factory's residential compound in Nanjing. But somehow I had a grand plan for myself. I had dreamed of going to university and then become a journalist and writer. I've had this dream ever since my teachers started reading my writing as a good example to show other students at my class. But my family was very poor. Now I enjoy telling my children the story of eating cicadas. Cicadas, yes. To satisfy our craving for meat, a luxury at that time. My brother and I used to go out on hot summer days to catch cicadas from the treetop and then roast them over a small bonfire and mount them up. Eating cicadas, the insect, yes, roasted cicadas actually tasty and crunchy. And they certainly provided us with lots of protein. I dare you try if you haven't. There's actually a serious message about the cicada story. The Chinese people have a reputation for loving to eat weird food. You have to understand that the Chinese cuisine is very much a famine cuisine. We have to learn to make good use of every part of an animal body. I think it's a common mistake to believe that in your culture, the way you do things is normal. I think if you want to really understand China, you just have to think out of the box and look beyond what we eat. Now back to my story. Fishing cicadas was fun, but working for a rocket factory wasn't, no matter how fascinating it might sound. Among other products, my factory produced intercontinental missiles that were capable of reaching North America. Don't worry, I was no nuclear scientist. I didn't have any top nuclear secret to tell. The job I was assigned to was to test a pressure gauge. Very simple and repetitive. China now, it's a lot freer. But back then, working for a regimental military factory, we had to endure so much control. No lipsticks, no high heel shoes, certainly no fishnet tights. Nothing was personal. I worked at the factory for 10 years. I never got any promotion. For one important reason, my bosses thought I wear a perm. In fact, I was one of the few Chinese who got naturally curly hair. In those days, only people with bourgeoisie outlook in life would wear perm, so I didn't have the correct ideology, so therefore I did not deserve a promotion, which sounds quite ridiculous. It's been very interesting for me to look at how China developed in recent times. While tightly gripping to power, the authorities have also slowly granted people with more personal freedom. Now people have the right to choose. They can choose where to live and how to live their lives. They can curl their hair, they can dye their hair, they can shave off their hair. That's your choice. So there's still a cage, there's still control. But the cage has grown so big, most people even don't feel the limits. But back when I was growing up in the shadow of the rockets, things were very different. The factory provided lots of things: housing, bathhouses, library, hospitals, cinemas, you name it. I went to kindergarten, the factory to kindergarten, and then went to schools run by the factory. Later on, as a factory worker, the factory confined and defined my life. Originally, I called my memoir A Frog in a Well. That's our famous story by our Asian philosopher Zhangs about this frog being trapped in the bottom of the well that cannot see the great world beyond but a patch of sky. I worked for 10 years. I just felt I was like a frog being trapped in the bottom of the factory well. So as an escape route, I decided to teach myself English, hoping to get a job as an interpreter with one of the foreign companies that was slowly setting up shops in Nanjing. Learning English back then was a lot more challenging task. To start with, I had to borrow a radio set from my cousin. I followed an English learning program called New Concept English. Every night at 7:30, I would turn on the radio and glued my ears to it, which cracked open a new world in front of me. Once I started, I just fascinated by this language system, so different from our Chinese character. So I would sometimes find myself talking English in the street as I was cycling in the dark street of Nanjing. I thought I was speaking English. I'll tell you what my English sounded like. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. I just said Merry Christmas and Happy New Year with a touch of Chinese accent. So some of my colleagues thought I was strange or crazy. So they started calling me Toad dreaming for swan's meat. I think in many cultures, people don't particularly like people who think or behave differently, especially in China, where there's a strong tendency towards conformity. Our traditional wisdom urged people do not stand out, do not show off. For example, a bird that flies out gets shot first. A nail sticks out gets hammered down. A pig getting fat should be afraid. Individualism and sense of self has never been a strong part of a culture. I think in some ways the Chinese communists went even further in destroying the sense of self. We were told to love Memoir, we were told to devote ourselves to the party and follow a prescribed path. But slowly things are changing. By the time I gained the grand title of Toad, I just didn't care what others thought about me. Because what I was learning wasn't just ABCs, but the whole culture package. So slowly I dared to be different. I started wearing short skirts. I still wear short skirts sometimes. One point I had this strange glass I could find in Nanjing, and without my parents knowing, I had boyfriends, always better educated men, who each showed me one or two things. After my English improved, I began to translate English documentaries, American films from English to Chinese. And I began to listen to BBC and the VOA, which broadcast news, very different from our propaganda. I grew to be very political with our friends. We would talk about politics all the time. What was China's future? Would the Western-style democracy answer to China? So by 1989, I organized the biggest demonstration among factory workers in support the democratic movement led by students in Tiananmen, because I believed that an individual could indeed make a difference. So my memoir was very much a personal of my personal journey of both sexual and political awakening. Interestingly, that journey also reflects what China went through in the 80s. The 80s, for many of us, was the most fascinating era when sea changes started happening. Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms opened China's door and transformed China way beyond the economic fields. And it was also time women started unbuttoning Chen Meimei's straitjacket and put on makeup and stylish clothes. One Western journalist famously joked, after China's economic reforms, Chinese women suddenly got breasts. Because before, all men and women were clad in Mao's lumpy jacket. So I think what today's China So the 80s was very, very much a time when China became what it is today. Today's China is an interesting and sometimes confusing mixture. Politically, it is authoritarian, and economically, there's market economy. But the market economy is not completed. The long hands government are still there, controlling all the important industry, petrol, telecom, mining. Since my book is called Socialism Is Great, people often ask me, is China still a socialist country? By the way, Socialism Is Great is not exactly my political statement. It's a title of a famous revolutionary song. I would have been happy to burst into singing for you if it is not a bit harsh to the ear. Now, back to the point of a socialism or communism. It's a bit confusing. Maybe let me share a story told to me by the former British Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott, a story about panda. In 1974, Sir Edward Heath paid a visit to China. He had just lost the election, so he was not a state leader, but because he was one of the first Western leaders who showed friendliness to China, so he was given full treatment. Mao received him several times, and before he left, Mao said, "Do you have any wish?" Sir Edward said, "Yes, I would like to have a panda, as goodwill from the Chinese people to the British people." Mao said, "No problem." A pair of panda were presented to him. Cha-Cha and Ching-Ching lived many years very happily in the London Zoo, but have probably died by the time John Prescott came to Beijing in 1998. Our then Premier Zhang warmly received him. The two pragmatic men got along very well. Before John Prescott left, Zhang said, "Do you have any wish?" John Prescott said, "Yes, I'd like to have a panda as goodwill from the Chinese people to the British people." Zhang said, "No problem. $1 million US. John Prescott, "What? Sir Edward didn't have to pay. Why did he have to pay 1 million? Our premier said, "This is called a socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics." So you see, there isn't a ready-made box that fits China development model. From planned economy to the market economy with Chinese characteristics, China has gone through dramatic changes. The same can be said about my personal life. In the end of 1990, after 10 years at the factory, I finally made my way to England. Once over there, a childhood dream stirred. I took a course in journalism. 3 years later, when I returned to China, I started my new career as a helper, assistant to the foreign journalist. And I very much loved the job. I learned a lot, but I found it frustrating because I didn't have the final say. So I gave up my job, pursue a career, a journalist of my own rights. I write in English for international publication. And to be honest, my English, I'm not language gifted. After diligently studying English for more than a quarter of a century, I still make the very basic mistakes I'm sure you have noticed. But I enjoy the challenge, and also I feel I have something different to offer that is insight into a society which still remains largely unknown in the West. Now I'm based in Beijing and work mainly as a writer. I'm just finishing and polishing my first novel about prostitution set in modern-day Shenzhen. That's a pure work of fiction I'd like to point out, not another memoir based on personal experience. I've done a few things in my life, but I'm not a prostitute yet. For me, prostitution opens a new, interesting window to see the tensions brought by the reform. I also I give a few lectures and a few speeches, and I serve as a social commentator, often being interviewed by the world media. So all the different bits of things I do actually come down to one thing, being the cultural bridge between China and the West. That's my self-appointed mission in life, something I feel very passionate about. You know, China has grown to be so important to be ignored, yet there's still so much misunderstanding, so much ignorance about China. And I have a strong impression that many people in the West fear about China or worried about China, at least feel uneasy about China and China's rapid rise. And in many ways, I can understand why there's such a fear. Politically, there's no democracy, and there's lack of transparency, and China has poor human rights. And also, China doesn't exactly know how to play the soft power. And I remember that at my book launching party in New York, the first question was fired by an elderly American gentleman, and he said, "Do we Americans stand a chance?" As if China going to take over America in a minute. And I understand why there's such a fear, but I think some of the fear is generated by ignorance. I think for some people, they have a very fixed idea about what China is like, and in some ways they're also trapped in their well. They're not willing to be open-minded to see how much has China changed. So what I want to do is to help people to understand where China was coming from, what are happening now, where China is going. I think once you know China better, then there's less fear, there's definitely more empathy. And I understand that some of you come from the business community. I mean, if you understand a bit of Chinese culture can certainly help you in your business dealings in China. For example, to help you to communicate with Chinese people. Many Chinese people never say no directly because it's regarded as rude to do so. So bear in mind that the Chinese culture belongs to the so-called high context culture, and you have to take into consideration of the particular location, the particular situation, the facial expression, and so on. So I find it quite interesting, and I think my experience of living abroad has helped me to understand my own culture because it has given me a new perspective. That's my story. A frog has been jumped out of the well. Now I feel my world is just so large. Every day, honestly, I just tell myself how lucky I am to be able to do things I have always wanted. I mean, it's not easy. Writing in any language is not easy, but in the end, I think fighting for something worthwhile keeps us going. Thank you for your attention.